anything more. I think maybe Washington could have done more to keep Lehman Brothers from failing. They didn't, and I think even they were shocked at how much the whole world financial system seized up as a result of that. And so the lesson was learned. You can't let these too big to fail financial institutions fail, or else they take down the whole system with them. And so we had the $700 billion bailouts, right? Those are winding down now. Many of the firms that got some of that money have paid it back already, etc. And so I'm not sure what history's verdict is going to be about that episode, but I suspect it was necessary and will be seen as that way later. The other thing was the Obama stimulus package. And so remember, although the crisis was clear by September, the Bush administration did nothing in its last 4 or 5 months. Obama comes into office. Within a month, we have a $787 billion stimulus package. Now, what's the point of that? It was deficit spending. Right? The government was upfront about the fact that it was going to borrow. We now have the deficit of the U.S. government this year is something like 9% of GDP, historically huge if you leave out World War II. 1 year in World War II, the deficit was 29% of GDP. So 9% today is small compared to the kind of borrowing that went on at the end of the Depression of the 30s, right? But nevertheless, $787 billion stimulus was exactly what we should have had, except it should have been twice as big. All right? It was also composed of a variety of things that could get through the Congress, especially the Senate. And you may remember that it only passed because 3 Republicans were willing to switch sides and vote for it. Okay? And so it consisted partly of tax cuts, for example. Is that on, or is it just for show?
No.
You can hear? Okay. Partially consisted of tax cuts, something like 250, 300 billion of that 787 billion was tax cuts, which were not very effective, frankly. It helped the measure get through Congress because lots of Democrats, in addition to Republicans, think that tax cuts is always the way to go. But frankly, in a deep recession, you give somebody tax cuts, the intent is to give them revenue out of which they can go out and spend. Because what you need to end a recession is more spending. More consumption spending by households, more investment spending by firms, or more government spending. Right? Well, you give tax, in early 2008, we had the original tax cut to prevent recession. And the recession was just getting started before the financial crash. And looking back on that, we think that 80% or probably of the tax cuts were just saved at that time. They didn't lead to more spending because already by the spring of the summer of 2008, when we were getting those $300 checks in the mail, we were afraid that we were the next person to get laid off, and therefore better to save that $300 than go out and spend it. So tax cuts in a deep recession are usually pretty ineffective, but to get the measure passed, about a third of that stimulus package was tax cuts. A bunch of it was just fiscal expenditures on highways, repair falling bridges, etc. And that was all to the good. After all, with the housing crisis having started the whole thing, lots of construction workers were unemployed. And if they're not going to be building houses, they can apply their talents to building roads or repairing bridges, etc. And so it was stuff that we needed. The infrastructure had had deteriorated considerably in the previous 20 years. So we needed to repair the infrastructure of the country, and in the process, the government spent money, gave it to construction companies, who went out and hired workers to do the work, who then in turn went out and bought, clothes and food and paid the rent and maybe their mortgage payment, etc. And so we get the multiplied effect. The first beneficiaries are the people who do the work, get the payment, they go out and spend it on other goods, which tends to employ other people to make consumer goods, etc. And that's what you hope will happen with a stimulus program like that. Government spending stimulates other spending. I still remember Susan Collins, who is one of the 2 Republican women senators from Maine, and one of the 3 Republicans at the time who voted for the stimulus package so that it could pass, coming out of negotiations with the Democrats and proudly announcing at a press conference in the hallway of Congress that she had managed to cut the amount that was going to be spent on the stimulus package. I forget how many billions of dollars she was bragging having cut from the package. And what she cut was aid to the states, which in my opinion was the single best use of stimulus money, even better than building highways and bridges. The problem is that 49 of the 50 states, and people keep asking me what the 50th is, and I don't know. 49 of the 50 states have constitutional prohibitions, as Florida does, against going into debt as a state government. So you can't have deficit spending, which is why over the last 3 or 4 years, and it started early here because the housing bust started early here, as state revenues fall, what the legislature has to do every April is to figure out ways to cut revenues down in line with state expenditures down in line with state revenues, right? Which is exactly the opposite of what the government ought to be doing in a recession. What the government ought to do in a recession is to borrow from the private sector, which is saving because they're afraid to spend, and the government should then spend to supplement for the now departed spending of the private sector. All right? We learned this from John Maynard Keynes in the 1930s. We saw it work with World War II spending and got us out of the Depression in a hurry. And it has, well, it's what I think is the correct approach to a recession. The government should borrow, engage in deficit spending, put people to work by spending when the private sector is afraid to spend.